Hi everybody, thank you for joining us today. I'll just wait a couple of minutes for more people to join the stream and then we'll begin. Okay, so let's begin. Welcome everyone. I'm Charlotte from the ECP. So some background about the ECP. The ECP is a self-help organization of sex workers and supporters working both on the street and in premises. So we campaign for the decriminalisation of prostitution, for sex workers' rights and safety, and for the resources to enable people to get out of prostitution if and when they want to. We are based at the Crossroads Women's Centre in London, alongside many other campaigning groups that we work closely with, one of which is speaking tonight. We also have international sister organizations in the US, the US Prostitutes Collective, as well as Empower in Thailand. So we are very pleased to be hosting this event to launch the findings of the study that we did with Dr. Laura Connelly called EU-Migrant Sex Work in the UK Post-Referendum. So let me just put my face up on the screen as of now. So we are very pleased to be hosting this event, and we have a number of exciting speakers that I will introduce as they speak. After the panel, there will be time for Q&A, so please do leave your questions in the comments section. In speaking about migrant sex work, we must realize that women who move country in hope of a better life come up against hostile immigration environments in the UK and are kept out of jobs by sexism, racism, and low wages. Prostitution becomes one of the few ways to survive, and many are mothers supporting families. This event is happening in the aftermath of the horrific shootings of migrant Asian massage workers in Atlanta earlier this year. And the attacks happened as the Trump era came to an end, during which racism was deliberately inflamed and promoted, including against Asian people, blaming us for the COVID virus. In response to the murders, we were glad to hear from migrant sex worker organizations like Red Canary Song because they reflected our own experiences. They strongly opposed anti-trafficking groups, which responded by calling for more police raids and increased surveillance of Asian massage parlors. And instead, Red Canary Song condemned police violence, rising poverty, and hostile immigration policies as contributing factors, and demanded that the decriminalization of sex work was the only way that sex workers, massage workers, sex trafficking survivors, and anyone criminalized for their survival and their livelihoods would ever be safe. We are glad to have contributed to this important research, which reports our experiences of the increase in racism and violence, including from the police and the authorities. And it is crucial information because if migrant sex workers are discriminated against and denied protection, then violent men are given a green light to attack with impunity. The Black Lives Matter movement, alongside the women's movement against violence, which exploded after the murder of Sarah Everard, has showed how corrosive it is to any society when injustice, discrimination, and violence are effectively condoned by the police and the government. You'll hear from about many of these issues being discussed tonight. So without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. So our first speaker is Dr. Laura Connelly. Let me just put it up on the screen. So Dr. Laura Connelly is a lecturer in criminology at the University of Salford and is an activist with the Northern Police Monitoring Project, a Manchester-based campaigning group that works to build community resistance to police harassment, violence, and racism. Laura, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Charlotte. So yeah, I'm here today to share some of the findings from a report that ECP and I are launching on EU migrant sex work post-referendum. And I also hope that we can use this space this evening to collectively think through how we can bolster the long-standing demands from sex workers for improved rights and safety, especially for those made more precarious by the hostile environment, by racism, and by criminalisation. Before I dive in, I just want to say a big thanks to ECP for all of their efforts with the research and also in putting this event together. And also to Fez Endelaus, who helped in the early stages of the research designing the survey. So a little bit of context first, and Charlotte's already given lots of that, but over recent decades, UK governments have implemented increasingly repressive immigration controls. So we've seen stricter conditions of entry being accompanied by an ever-expanding immigration detention estate. We've seen the increased use of criminal penalties for so-called immigration offences, and we've seen this increasingly hostile environment for people who migrate to the UK. And the UK can be particularly hostile for migrant sex workers, with the sort of quasi-criminalised and stigmatised nature of sex work compounding some of those negative effects that can arise from migrant status. And of course, these effects can be felt greatest by racially minoritised, transgender, non-binary migrant sex workers. So it was in that socio-political context, and also with ECP becoming increasingly aware of migrant sex workers being arrested and detained and deported post-referendum, that we set out to explore what impact the referendum had had on migrant sex workers in the UK, EU migrant sex workers specifically, and also what strategies those EU migrant sex workers employ to navigate their sex work in that context. We used an online survey to collect people's views and experiences, and that survey was available both in English and in Romanian. And 41 EU migrant sex workers completed that survey, which in research terms is a fairly small number, but what I think really speaks volumes about how reluctant migrant sex workers are to speak out about sex work in this current social and political climate. Regardless, the research gives us really important insight into experiences post-referendum. The findings that I'm going to share today are, they relate to EU migrant sex workers specifically, but non-EU migrant sex workers share many of these experiences and can in fact feel some of these experiences, these negative repercussions of the referendum even more acutely. So I'm just going to share a few things from the report today, some of the key effects that the referendum result has had on EU migrant sex workers. So one of the key changes for EU migrant sex workers post-referendum has been around their ability to earn a living through sex work. So almost 80% of EU migrant sex workers in the report said that their ability to earn income from sex work has decreased since the referendum. And this has led them to make a whole series of changes to their working practices. So from things like working longer hours, working different hours, night shifts, to changing workplaces and making changes to the types of clients that they're accepting. On that latter point, some migrant sex workers said that they're avoiding British clients now in order to help keep them safe from xenophobia, whilst others actually said that they're avoiding non-British clients. Either way, it's really clear that some migrant sex workers are having to make tough decisions about what clients to accept post-referendum, decisions that can limit their client base and therefore their income. However, other migrant sex workers in the report said that they're less able to decline clients and are instead compelled to to make compromises to their safety in order to make enough money to live off. One sex worker said, "I've had to say yes to more clients, including clients that I've previously rejected and who are requesting services I'm not comfortable with. I offer more services than I used to, and I've decreased my rates." EU migrant sex workers are also facing more violence post-referendum. So over half of respondents said that they've seen actual increases in the levels of violence that they're experiencing. And more than half of the migrant sex workers that responded said they've experienced xenophobic hate crime. Some have been physically assaulted, including one migrant sex worker who said that they've been attacked with eggs and tomatoes. Others have been verbally abused. It's really clear then that violent men can use migrant sex workers' potentially uncertain immigration status to act with impunity. One sex worker explained, "Punters are more confident to report us to the police and Home Office. Their threats sound like, 'I'm going to get you deported if you don't give me my money back.'" Migrant sex workers also spoke about an increased fear of arrest and detention and deportation post-referendum. So again, over half of respondents thought that their risk of arrest had increased. 66% thought that their risk of deportation had increased since the referendum. Rachel Stewart and Pippa Grenfell's report for Doctors of the World, which was released earlier this week, makes some similar observations around this. So noting that really intensive and sustained police and immigration enforcement that we've seen in recent times. Some sex workers in our report reported that they've been raided and arrested. Others have been threatened with deportation. And this is despite the fact that sex workers can technically claim self-employed status under the EU settlement scheme. That's the scheme that EU citizens can apply for settled status post-Brexit. But many sex workers are disadvantaged in their applications to that scheme. So they might, for example, not have the documentation that's needed to prove continual residence in the UK. One sex worker said how they'd been raided after the referendum, how they'd been arrested for brothel keeping, even though they were the sex worker. And then although the case was dropped, they were still given a letter which said that they weren't allowed to stay in the UK because they weren't exercising their treaty rights. So because there's not a legal precedent for sex workers to claim self-employed status, migrant sex workers are having to fight their deportation on a case-by-case basis. And of course, these fears of arrest and deportation have really they have real impacts in terms of mental health and well-being and safety. And this was summed up really by one survey respondent who said, "I'm now a lot more anxious in general. I avoid working now, even if I can't afford it. And then I end up in desperate situations where I have to take whoever calls." There was a strong belief, a kind of key finding that came out from the research was that the police can't be relied upon in the event that that a sex worker is attacked. So 44% of respondents described their relationship with the police as poor or very poor. And again, this was summarised by a sex worker who said, "I've been threatened by men on the street who say they're going to attack me. When I went to the police, they said, 'Are you telling me that you're a prostitute? Because if you are, I'm going to arrest you.' I've experienced increasing racism and sexism from the police since the referendum was announced." So what is really clear then is that far from being able to rely upon the police for support, migrant sex workers are facing harm at the hands of the police. They're facing increased criminalisation. And because of close working relationships between the police and immigration, they're facing increased risk of deportation. And as respondents explained in the survey, this means that some sex workers are compelled to compromise on their safety by working alone because arrest as a result of working together in groups or in pairs with other sex workers could result in deportation. So sex workers are having to compromise on their safety because of these problematic sex work laws. Despite these changes, these negative repercussions of the referendum, there is, of course, always resistance, both at the individual level and at the collective level. And ECP and others have worked with sex workers to successfully fight deportation cases. And sex workers are also, importantly, finding ways to document a record of wage labour so that they can apply for settled status. As the International Committee on the Rights of Sex Workers in Europe's report, which was also published earlier this week, shows, sex worker-led organisations are doing important work to defend rights and offer support to sex workers in a context where the state is denying these things. Our report then makes a series of evidence-based recommendations that bolster calls for action that sex workers and those who are concerned with migrant rights have been making for a long time. So firstly, we must continue to fight for decriminalisation. Alongside this, we call for the government to remove historical convictions of sex workers, particularly given that those convictions can be used to deport sex workers. Third, we join the calls, which I'm sure you'll hear more about soon, from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants and others, for EU citizens to be granted automatic settled status in the UK. We also recommend increased financial assistance for migrants so that sex workers are not compelled to accept dangerous clients in order to simply make enough money to live. And also for the end to the hostile environment. And you can support these calls by emailing your local MP using the template that we've put on the ECP website. So just briefly to sum up then, with the repressive police crime and sentencing bill knocking on the door, I think it's becoming increasingly urgent that we hold the state to account for the hostility it directs towards sex workers generally, and migrant sex workers specifically. So it's more important than ever that wherever we're organising from, be that as sex workers or as allies, we make sure that the state finally listens to what migrant sex workers are saying about their experiences. Thanks so much. Thanks, Charlotte.
Thank you, Laura. So just a reminder to all watching that you can post your questions in the comments section. We'll be having a Q&A section later after all the speakers are done. And do check out the comment section as well for the links as mentioned in all our speeches. So here next, from 3 women in the ECP about their experiences of police racism, illegality, detention and deportation, as well as Laura Watson from the ECP on the obstacles and successes for sex workers fighting for justice. Without further ado, Laura, the floor is yours.
I am Maria. I'm from Romania. I know lots of women who working in the street in North London. They are all Romanian women and they are working for money to raise children and family. The police are terrible. They arrest women all the time and immigration try and deport women all the time. The woman who was working and spoke better English and tried to help another woman was targeted most because the police hate that she was trying helping them. We want sex work decriminalized so women don't have to live in fear of being arrested for feeding their families. If women have a better alternative, they will do it instead.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melissa. I work with in the sexual industry since I am 15 years old. I started working like this on the streets in Brazil when I was again 15 years old. Now I am 25, and I moved to UK on 2015. Of course, as many girls looking for a better life, looking for a better opportunity to live, with respect, with with good conditions of life. I moved from Brazil. I left my family, I left my country, my house, and everything to come here, looking for more safety, because I am a trans. Brazil is the biggest number of trans murder every year, and it's very sad. When I arrived in the UK, I was working for few like few months in a place, and always I was very, very afraid about the police, about these stories I heard about another girls. And also from time to time we had to move the flat, to not be suspicious or anything. Always really afraid of police, of immigrations. And in 2019, I was working with my friend in a flat. Basically, I wasn't work with her in the flat. I was just there with her because she didn't want to stay by herself. And also, she got robbed in this flat. I was with her in this day. It was terrible. It was really sad for us. We got completely in panicky. Today we still, really, really afraid sometimes when we are working the night time because the robbery. It was really sad, really wow. The impact I cannot explain, to be honest. And because these I used to be with her, and one day I remember it's now it's already 2 years because it was on 1st May 2019. And basically the immigration offices of they called for my friend, booking appointment, and they came. They straight away got into the flat. They didn't ask her if she allowed them to go into the flat. They didn't give any papers for her. They just, when she opened the door, they just came in, and another guys from the immigration office also started to come in the flat. I remember it was about 5 or 6 people in the flat. They asked for my visa, and today I am Italian citizen, but in this time I didn't have the right papers to stay in the UK. I was illegal, and they said for me I couldn't work, I couldn't stay in this country. And they said for me, well, they asked me so many questions. They asked for how long I was working with this, why I came to the country, and all these questions. Also, they got my phone, all my things. It was really sad for me. I feel really scared about what's going on. They're gonna send me back to Brazil. I don't want to leave the country. Also, I have a life. I have friends. I have everything here. I thought, oh my gosh, what's going on now? What gonna happen with me? It was horrible for me, really. I Today I still feeling sometimes the impact of this situation in my life. And in this day, I remember it took me like more than 8 hours to do all the process. They took me like to a place, immigration station, something like that. I don't really remember the name. And there they took a pictures of me. They said many things for me. They said I couldn't come to the country again for 10 years. They said a lot of stuff for me. I got really scared. It was like a prison, to be honest. And it's really, really bad. Also, after like 18 hours talking, taking pictures, fingerprints, and saying thousand of things, show me papers and said that I have to sign up all these papers. It was my deportation. I didn't have any options. And also the papers, I couldn't really read the papers because it was like a very difficult English to read in different words, I never seen and never heard. I could read, but I don't really didn't know what was there, to be honest. And after, like, I remember it was between 6 and 8 hours, they took me to a different place. And the name of this place is Earl's Wood, if I remember. They took me there. I was there for about 2 days because I remember it was one Wednesday afternoon. They found me in the flat, and they released me from the earliest wood on Friday afternoon. Yeah, it was like between something like 48 hours there. And they released me from there in a bail condition, saying in any time they could remove me from the country. I had to wait, but also I couldn't work, I couldn't do anything. My friend helped me so much with house, with food, with everything, because they said for me I couldn't work, I couldn't do anything. I was just in the country, but I was afraid to do something. If I didn't have money in this time, wow, what could happen with me? And they said also they could send me back at any time. They didn't send me back in this time because I had as I said before, the flat I was with my friend, we got robbed there. About 5 guys came into the flat. It was really terrible experience. And because I had this problem in the court, they couldn't give me the deportation yet. But they said for me, as soon as the court was done, probably they would send me back home. um yeah, it was really sad. My friends also, I have many friends, they work, they're really, really afraid all the time about police, about immigration officers. They are really afraid, all the time. You work afraid, you feel scared, you feel intimidated, you don't want to have problems with anyone. And yeah, it's a really complicated situation. I know many people, if have something with them, they don't want to go to the police because they have a fear of what's gonna happen with them, how gonna they treat them, if they got they will be you know in problems also with the immigration office. It's really, really sad. I know many people who works always afraid, scared of what's going on if the immigration or the police came into the flat. This is a little bit of about my experience, my personal experience. I'm sorry for my English. And also, I want to speak a little bit about the Brexit. The work really changed after Brexit, and now we are afraid also because well, most of the people I know, they are European. And what's going on with us now? We are afraid if the police, come into the flat and say for us, oh, you are European and you cannot work anymore, or you cannot stay anymore here because, they can do this stuff with us. What I'm gonna say if the immigration come into my flat, or if the police come into my flat? What I'm gonna say to them if they say, "Oh, you have to leave the country"? It's not many things I can say. It's very sad, to be honest. And the impact of Brexit, we are feeling really. deep. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. That's a little bit of me, a little bit about my experience. Okay. I hope you are all well. And once again, thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Maria. I'm from Lithuania. I've been working in central London, Voca flat for a long time. From beginning of last year, September, my landlord trying to evict me, and I have no idea what reason and why. So he had broken in the property and tried to kick me out on the street by forcing his entry to the flat. He had come with police officers claiming that I'm squatting. He had sent people who was impersonating police just to get some information from me. And he had sent me a letter with threats towards me, harassing and treating me very badly, even thought I have a full right to be at the property, and police is not helping me and not investigating the threats of attack on me properly, and just they want everything goes away. Don't If they don't take serious this matter just because I'm in sex industry. I've been living in fear and no help from police now almost a year, and it's really frightening. And police, it's just because I'm in sex industry, they're looking down on me and won't help me at all.
Hi everyone. I'm Laura from ECP. So you've heard the three women in the ECP network speak about their situations, and alongside the campaigning work we do, we also fight individual cases. For example, defending women against charges of loitering and soliciting and brothel keeping charges. And brothel keeping is a law that's used mostly against sex workers working together from premises. Since the pandemic, this legal casework has increased, and migrant women in our group face additional obstacles to getting justice. So I just wanted to give some examples of the casework that we do and that I've been involved in. So migrant women and women of colour are disproportionately targeted by the police for raids and so-called welfare visits. Women get more money stolen during these raids, or are raided more regularly, or are closed down more often. In one area, police raided about 7 premises, and the only women prosecuted for brothel keeping were Chinese women. In cases we fought, women of colour get heavier prison sentences if convicted. The police may raid premises with the justification that they're looking for victims of trafficking, but always scrutinise women's immigration status and regularly threaten deportation. Racism is sometimes blatant, calling Romanian women gypsy in a disparaging way, for example. Migrant women are disadvantaged because not able to apply for benefits such as universal credit because of no recourse to public funds. We have seen how migrant women are the first to be investigated, and where they are entitled to benefits get cut off arbitrarily. Left completely destitute during COVID, we're helping one woman now who doesn't have money for formula for her baby. There's no safety net whatsoever. Being destitute changes the sex work you do, forces you to take more risks, work longer hours, take clients others may be able to refuse, as you've heard. Migrant women are more likely to be preyed on by social services who threaten to take their children. One woman recently was taken advantage of and pushed around by social services because English is not her first language. We asked Support Not Separation Coalition, based at the Women's Centre where we're based, for help, and they stopped any move for social services to be more involved. Reporting to the police is just a nightmare, and even with our involvement and also with help from Women Against Rape and National Ugly Mugs, the police just fob us off, close cases without notice and without investigation, and downplay the seriousness of attack. When we're hearing that so many police officers are guilty of domestic violence themselves, it becomes clearer why they feel able to dismiss violence against sex workers. women are fighting back against this, and women are saying we have the right to be here. We've got women out of Yarlswood and Stop Deportations, and we're appealing deportation orders, evictions, being outed, and attempts to shame women online, arrests, and low universal credit assessments. As you've heard, many women come to the UK to save their lives. A lot of women in our group have fled domestic violence, for example, want to live a safer, more independent life, and some women are sending money back home, supporting families. The sexism, racism, and criminalisation we've been describing is part of a bigger picture to cut down on women's economic options so we have less power to refuse other low-wage, zero-hour exploitative work. So the fight for decriminalisation and for money in women's hands is a fight for more choices and against being divided from other workers. We have a rights sheet against deportation, and where the information gathered is based on the experience of women in the ECP network, both what women have suffered and the ways they found to defend themselves. You might also be interested in our dossier, Sex Workers Are Getting Screwed by Brexit, and our campaign film, Migrant Sex Workers Fight Police Illegality and Racism. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And just a reminder, if you have any questions, please do post them in the comments below and we'll address them later. So next, we have Caitlin from the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants, JCWI, on their campaign to extend the deadline for EU people to apply for the right to live in the UK. Caitlin, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. And thank you very much to ECB for having me this evening. So yeah, I'm going to speak mainly about the EU settlement scheme and the risks to EU citizens that with the deadline coming up. So with just 6 weeks to go until the EU settlement scheme deadline on June 30th, tens of thousands of EU citizens remain at risk of slipping through the cracks. It's important to remember that this is a political choice. The way that the EUSS is currently designed means that anyone who doesn't apply on time will automatically fall out of status and rights. There's overwhelming evidence that shows it's the most vulnerable EU citizens, including older and disabled people, looked after children, Roma communities, who are at greatest risk of being left behind by the scheme. JCWI did some research earlier this year into EU care workers, and we found that care workers and other key workers, the very people we're relying on to get us through the COVID crisis, are also in real danger of being left behind by the scheme. Our research shows that it's not just people who are perceived of as vulnerable or marginalised, but also workers in sectors who might not be seen that way, but where they're working with precarious employment arrangements, low pay and poor working conditions. So sectors such as agriculture, construction and manufacturing. Now, while there's a lack of research into the experiences of EU sex workers, I would imagine that they're very likely to be a group who also face barriers for some of the reasons that have been mentioned earlier and are in danger of slipping through the cracks as well. They exist at the intersection of marginalised and criminalised people and also workers in precarious and often poor working conditions without proper protections. So thinking a bit about what the risks are to those who don't apply. So the EUSS will create a significant new population of undocumented migrants vulnerable to hostile environment policies, including detention and removal. But whilst there is this cliff edge on the 30th of June, it will also trigger a silent wave of EU citizens who will become undocumented over the next 5 years when they're unable to upgrade their pre-settled status to settled status. This is not likely to be an insignificant minority. If even 1% of the millions of EU residents living in the UK is unable to apply on time, that's tens of thousands of people without leave to remain. So for anyone who doesn't know, the hostile environment, it's a phrase that's used a lot, but in formal terms, it's a set of policies introduced in 2012 by the then Home Secretary Theresa May, designed to make life in the UK impossible for people without the right papers. It turns doctors, landlords, police officers, and other public authorities into border guards and tasks them with carrying out immigration checks. It also prevents most migrants, including those with visas, from accessing most benefits under the no recourse to public fund condition. And it increases discrimination against anyone who looks or sounds foreign. Unsurprisingly, the hostile environment comes down hardest on those who are the most marginalised and the least recognised by the state. So that's undocumented migrants, sex workers, homeless people, Black and minority ethnic people, and travelling communities. And it makes all migrants, but particularly those who are undocumented, less likely to seek support with their health as a victim of a crime or to report exploitation at work. In the middle of a pandemic, when it's crucial that everyone can access free healthcare and the state safety net, this is particularly worrying. The hostile environment means that any EU citizen who has lived in the UK for years, built their family here, made a life here, could be criminalised for something as simple as going to work or renting a flat after the deadline. We're already seeing EU citizens wrongfully being denied access to housing and services. We've heard about a rise in arrests and deportations of EU sex workers since the Brexit vote, and this is only going to get worse after the deadline. So in terms of the government response, they're talking about how many millions of people have applied, and we all welcome that. That's brilliant that a lot of people have found the scheme very straightforward, but we're not hearing anything on those who lose out, for whom the consequences are disastrous and potentially life-ruining. The government is using the success of grant-funded charities as justification for not making crucial changes to the EU settlement scheme to protect EU citizens' rights. But I know from speaking to many of these charities that they say the funding is not enough. It doesn't scratch the surface of what's needed to reach all EU citizens, and no amount of funding in reality would ever ensure that everyone applied by a deadline. In addition, despite guidance on late applications to the scheme, even where this does provide a route back to status in some cases after the deadline, this is never an excuse to making people undocumented even temporarily. The impacts of this can be huge: criminal liability, exposure to the hostile environment, and also jeopardizing potential future claims, such as for citizenship. So what are we asking for? JCWI has been, along with other organisations, calling on the government to lift the EU settlement scheme deadline and grant automatic settled status to all EU citizens and non-EU family members. This is the only way to avoid tens of thousands more EU citizens losing their status. Some of the other changes we would like to see is proper monitoring to work out exactly who is slipping through the cracks and how to enable them to apply. Physical documentation, because we know that a lack of physical documentation leads to an increase in discrimination, as we've seen through JCWI's right to rent case. We took the government to court over the right to rent case, and it was found by both the High Court and the Court of Appeal to cause racial discrimination. We want legal aid to be available for EUSS cases. There's going to be more need for this after the deadline, with more complex cases of people who need help, support, helping them to do a late application. And we want the automatic renewal of pre-settled status to settled status, so that people aren't forced out of status time and time again. But the biggest fight is to tackle the root problems at the heart of this system. And that's why our biggest kind of call as an organisation is to end the hostile environment and the cycle of irregular migration. So we have a new campaign that we launched last week called We Are Here, which looks at the experiences of undocumented migrants and proposes simple, straightforward and workable solutions, such as one 5-year route to settlement to replace the many long and arduous and expensive current routes, the decriminalisation of all forms of work, including sex work and birthright citizenship. So obviously this is all quite doom and gloom with the deadline coming up, but I would say that the pandemic, as much as it has caused so much difficulty, also does present the opportunity for change. We've seen changes brought in that campaigners have been fighting for decades overnight. And I would encourage everyone to use JCWI's tool to write to your MP and ask them to call on the government to lift the deadline and grant EU citizens automatic rights. We're now 5 weeks from the deadline, so it couldn't be more urgent. And finally, I would encourage anyone who's interested in migrants' rights to join JCWI. We're a membership organisation, and then you can join the conversation for a fairer and better immigration system. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. And lastly, we have Crystal from the Global Women Against Deportation on opposition to detention and the new plan for immigration. Crystal?
Thank you. From what's been said so far and what women have reported and what Laura Connelly's important research makes very clear is how the government is widening its racist and hostile environment to take away the rights of other sectors of migrants, just as they've done with asylum seekers from countries in the global south and the Windrush generation who had their historic right to live in the UK as Commonwealth citizens terminated. It's also clear how much racism and violence against women and girls has worsened since Brexit and COVID, not only against sex workers and communities of colour, whether we have papers or not, whether we're trans, gay, disabled, but the rise of the Black Lives Matter, which is a multiracial and inclusive movement, is really an important part of the counter-offensive to that. I'm part of Women Against Rape, which is part of the Global Women Against Deportations group based here at the centre. It includes the All African Women's Group, a 100-strong organisation of women asylum seekers and refugees who from every continent. It includes Legal Action for Women and Women of Colour in the Global Women's Strike. And together with other groups at the centre, we've been fighting against deportation and detention for decades. The aim of detention is to terrorise and keep people isolated, cut off from community and other support, to limit your access to lawyers or to appeal injustices. But women haven't been deterred. There's been a big movement against detention, led by women inside Yarlswood, at least 7 hunger strikes, which helped to get publicity, expose racist abuse, exploitation, violence, rape, and other sexual assaults by the guards, the inadequate food and health care, and the pain of being separated from their children and loved ones. And there'll be a report put up in the chat about our work there. Over the years, we've helped many win their release and the right to stay, including 2 women who were detained 3 times and 2 who resisted 9 deportation flights. All 4 have won their papers, proving they should never have been detained, and nor should anyone else. The movement from inside has inspired a movement outside, so that when a new detention centre for women was proposed, people were on the ground and running and much better prepared to work together to stop this centre, Hassock Fields, from operating. We are part of the Abolish Detention, a dedicated and creative group of young people who are mobilising to prevent this centre from opening, working directly with the local community and using strategies developed over decades. Again, we'll put details on how you can support that in the chat. We also highlight the particular discrimination that rape victims face in the asylum and immigration process. We fight cases in a collective self-help way, and what that means is that women are centrally involved in their own case. Together, we work to understand the case and the law, to hold lawyers to account, and again, we've had many victories. What we're up against now is women's situation being used by Patel to justify her new immigration plan, and it's based on lies. Vulnerable women and children are being elbowed out of the way by men crossing the channel in boats and jumping the queue. The reality is that women and children applying to come here are routinely refused. Asylum seekers make meritless claims, clogging up the system, causing a backlog, but fewer people are reaching the UK. And the only backlog is manufactured by the Home Office with built-in delays to make it treacherous for people to survive here. As so many of you will know from your own experiences, austerity falls heaviest on women, as we are the primary carers. Destitution is an official policy, leaving people to survive on £37 a week. This makes women seeking asylum and their children even more vulnerable to exploitation and violence while they live in limbo. Several mothers in All African Women's Group describe being penniless while fighting for their right to stay and having no alternative but to exchange money for sex, to keep a roof over their heads, to feed and clothe and educate their children. Some have been forced to do domestic work and childcare. Women have been raped and beaten by those who exploit their precarious situations. There's much more about this on our blog. Patel's immigration plans are not new, and they're not hers alone. They come from a government leaning towards fascism, with bills like the Policing, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill, which aims to crack down on all our rights to protest, reject women's demand to end rape and other violence against us, and to lower everyone's expectation of getting justice for the crimes committed against us. It's just come out that 130 women have reported domestic violence and abuse by partners who are serving police officers. Every one of them must be sacked for us all to be safe. Stop and search of young people of colour has skyrocketed under lockdown. Chief of London's police, Cressida Dick, who persistently denies the evidence of institutionalised racism in her own force, is covering up institutionalised sexism being revealed by women officers and ex-cops. She's never been held to account for the murder of John Charles de Menezes, a migrant worker, and for other people of colour who were attacked and killed on her watch. She must be sacked. We cannot afford to let the government have unrestricted powers to increase surveillance, criminalise and incarcerate us when we are working, whether we are working in the sex industry or trying to pull down statues or seeking asylum, protesting climate change, or calling out Britain's support for apartheid Israel, arms sales and wars, while looting resources and people and wealth from other countries. The Kill the Bill movement has sprung up across the UK and been inclusive of sex workers, and we're very glad for that. The best of the movement is determined to stop the police getting more powers. They already abuse the ones they have, as sex workers know only too well. The rise of a multiracial inclusive movement with people from every background, led by young people, particularly women of colour, is a sign of how we are beginning to come together. And that is a massive force. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. So now we will open the floor to questions. Let me just put all participants on the screen. So the first question we have is from Isabella, and I will put it up on the screen for everybody to see. Are there any local schemes through grassroots organizations or local political organizations that are currently encouraging and assisting people to apply for settled status? Do you think local initiatives might help? So Caitlin, would you like to take this question?
Sure. Yeah, there are lots of local schemes. There's a list that I can post in the chat of organisations that are supporting people to apply for their status. And there's also an organisation called Settled who they train up volunteers so that you can help people apply for their status. So I'm sure there'll be local schemes. We do, it's the opinion of well, it's my opinion and also JCWI's opinion, though, that unless we tackle the root issues and the systems at play in the immigration system, it's not going to resolve things. And unfortunately, as we've kind of heard today, some of the people that are the most hidden away from public life, from the authorities, are the people who are most at risk, but equally the people who are least likely to come forward and seek support. So I think we need long-term solutions as well. But in the meantime, I would definitely encourage people to join their local migrant support groups. And yeah, we'll post in the chat.
Thank you, Caitlin. Is there anybody else who would like to jump in for this question? No, sure. Okay, so let's move on. So Giorgio asks, what center? So maybe Chrissy, would you like to just give some background to the Crossroads Women's Center?
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Giorgio, for that question. It gives me an opportunity to explain that Crossroads Women's Centre is the base for 17 organisations. These include Women Against Rape that I work with, but also We have Win Visible, which is an organization for women with visible and invisible disabilities, Queer Strike, the Global Women Strike. We can point you to a website where you can see all of the organizations that are based here. And I think the fantastic resource that this center is a resource for those of us, no matter who we are. I mean, I have to say there's also a men's group. We like working with men. It's a men's group based here, Payday Men's Network. But no matter who we are in society, we can come together to work here, but also to get support, also to raise our issues, also to hold on to our autonomy as the different sectors we are, at the same time as making demands collectively to win the struggles, which, you know, a meeting like tonight has made very clear. We're all interlinked and we are fighting the same issues in one way or another. So having the resources and the expertise to be able to turn to. So, for example, a woman who might be a woman seeking asylum who's disabled by the torture that she's been through can get help from the disability group Win Visible. And that's really important because it means we know that we are referring her to an organization which has a very good, strong track record of fighting against the injustices that particularly women with disabilities face. So it's a wonderful center which we are hoping to get open again very soon. And when we do, we would encourage people to come join us and, you know, to get to know us. Maybe somebody will put into the chat. Oh, they have. Fantastic. I'd recommend you look at the website. There's a very good little film about our history going right back to the 70s in King's Cross. I won't do a spoiler.
Thank you very much, Chrissy. So the next question is, what can people do to help? It's a broad question, but would anybody like to take this one? Yep. Laura C?
Yeah, I don't mind kicking us off, but yeah, others can input too, of course. So I think in terms of some of the findings from our research, with ECP and I's research, and also Caitlin and Chrissy are drawing on, I think key here is support around sex workers, calls for decriminalisation. So these are long-standing calls. It's not something that's new. But in terms of supporting migrant sex workers, I think that it's absolutely key. So in terms of practical steps to get involved in that, you know, get onto ECP's website. There's lots of resources and campaigns there that you can join. And there's other sex worker-led organisations in the UK that you can support, such as Swarm. So, you know, follow social media, get on websites and join some of the campaigns there. And another practical step that I think all of us can take is by writing to our MPs. So ECP and I developed a MP letter template which you can use. So again, if you go onto ECP's website after today's talk, you'll be able to use that letter template and email your MP. And I think Caitlin also spoke about a similar MP letter template that you can use around calling for automatic settled status for all EU citizens. So there I think some practical steps. And of course, you know, there's loads of opportunities at the moment. Chrissy mentioned about the Kill the Bill coalitions that are emerging. There's loads of opportunities to join in that movement. You know, there's street protests, you know, all the time at the moment in major cities and in smaller cities too. So look out for some of those in your local area and really get behind that, because all of these issues are really interconnected, as I think other people have said.
Thank you, Laura. Anybody else? Yes, Caitlin?
I was also just going to sort of give a shout out to what we saw happen last week in Glasgow with everyone who came together to stop the removal of 2 men from their community. And like, I would 100% agree with Laura in encouraging people to join campaigns, write to your MP, do that kind of big overarching stuff, but also like local community is where so much resistance happens. And I think that was a real example of the change that we can do just as sort of people and coming together in our communities. So stand as allies with migrants and with sex workers and with marginalized people in your communities, and that can also create real change.
Thank you. So now moving on to the next question. What has happened to UK people working in Europe? Has their treatment basically been any better?
Is that kind of a general about British citizens, or is that a sex worker specific question? Sorry.
I believe it's a sex worker specific question.
Okay.
Laura, would you take that?
I think it's a general question.
Oh, okay.
But
I mean, if it's in relation to sort of what I've been talking about, so over half of EU member states have they've brought in the type of system that we would want to see in the UK. So it's called a declaratory scheme, which means nothing, but that basically means you're granted automatic rights and you don't have to apply in order to receive those rights. And 13 EU member states have got that kind of system, and 12, including the UK, haven't. So I don't know a massive amount about the situation in EU member states for British citizens, but I know that a lot of them are introducing the kind of things that we would want to see, and a lot of them are being a lot more flexible and lenient with British citizens over there.
Would anybody else like to chime in? No? Sure. Okay. And then we'll move on to the next question then. Can you say more about the connection between the new revelations about police domestic violence and the police attitude and violence versus women in the sex industry?
yeah, I can. I think I mentioned that in my in what I said. What we were speaking about is, you know, a lot of what's been said is the police's sort of attitude and response to women when reporting violence to the police is go away, leave us, you know, this is just part of the job, what are you complaining about? Or even, you know, actually threatening or arresting sex workers for prostitution offences. And you know, that can lead to and deportation, as has been said. And so that's the police's attitude when you go and report violence. You can't find one police officer to help you anywhere. On the other hand, when you're being raided or arrested, 20 police officers turn up outside your house and are ready to raid you. I think the connection is that you know, if the police are if there are lots of officers who are doing domestic violence at home, then obviously don't have it's not their priority to deal with it or to stop it, and it's not their priority generally. You know, a lot of organisations like Women Against Rape are saying that rape has been decriminalised because the conviction rate is so low and nothing's being done about it. And that's the situation that we're in. The police are refusing to do anything about it. And the connection is that if they're doing that in their private lives as well, it indicates why. But it's also sorry, I can hear myself. I'm getting distracted. I can hear myself back from some other computer. Yeah, that's the connection basically.
Laura, would you like to chip in?
Yeah. Just to add to what Laura's already said, you know, I think when we're talking about sex workers, you know, Laura's mentioned, and you saw that in the audio clips from some of the migrant sex workers that are involved with ECP. You know, we see all too clearly that the police aren't a source of support, often for sex workers when they're wanting to report violence. We see, as the question suggested, we see that there is, the latest revelation around police officers serving police officers perpetrating domestic violence, and as part of the Northern Police Monitoring Project, which, as Charlotte mentioned at the start of today's session, we're monitoring misconduct hearings for Greater Manchester Police. And again, another trend you see in them is that there's lots of misconduct on the basis of around gender. So, inappropriate conduct amongst police officers. So I think, what all this points to is that this is an institutional problem. Much like, racism is endemic within the police, it is institutional in nature. So too is this issue of misogyny and sexism. So I think that, what I'd add there is that, I don't see this as being a problem with just a few bad apples within the police that can be dealt with, through piecemeal reform or extra training. The whole apple cart is rotten. And that's what we're getting at when we talk about institutional sexism within the police. So yeah, that's just my little addition to what Laura was saying.
Thank you. So next yes, Chrissy.
Sorry, I just wanted to say something about, the fact that it is also that the police have the power, and in generally, men who have that power, the experience is that they will abuse it, particularly if they can get away with it. And I think that's what we have to be looking at, is holding them all to account. They need to lose their jobs. They need to lose their pensions. They need no longer, to be taken out of the equation of having any power at all. And I think that's a call that's, going to be growing as the movement grows. But I just wanted to add one more thing, which is related really to a little bit earlier when we were discussing what people could do. I omitted to say that we in Women Against Rape have an action plan alert to oppose the new plan for immigration. And it's like everybody else has mentioned, it's a template letter that you can put your postcode in and write direct to your MP. So I would encourage people to do that. And I would encourage people to come on the demonstrations, which are ongoing and are going to be ongoing, because that is really one way in which, when we see who we are and we see who we are, what power our movement has, it lifts everybody. And I think we're going to need that as we approach the summer. We're going to all need to be lifted, because it is urgent. The work that we need to do is urgent to turn things around and to have the kind of world that we want to live in.
Thank you, Chrissy. So the next question is from Rachel. Wondered if any of us had any thoughts on the recent Doctors of the World report about increased policing of sex workers over the COVID period. Yep, Laura?
Yes, thank you. Yes, it's a very important report which was published. I think the other Laura mentioned it at the beginning of the week, and about the criminalisation of sex workers. I mean, we have seen that the criminalisation has continued throughout the pandemic, has increased in some cases. Women have been, we've been doing a lot of eviction cases specifically, where women have agreed a COVID rate of rent, and then that the landlord has said, okay, now you owe the full amount, and women obviously haven't been able to, because they haven't been able to get back to work or as they would normally, and so fighting those cases, also deportation cases, and a lot of violence and stalking cases, and stalking especially as women have moved online, and loitering and soliciting cases at the beginning of the pandemic, where where the first lockdown, nobody knew what was happening, and that was the police's priority, to be going around arresting people and criminalising people, when clearly something else should have been happening. I mean, we were demanding emergency payments for sex workers, so that women had money straight away in order to not have to go out and work and pay for whatever was needed, not to have to go out to work. And the government refused, basically, and said that they had already spent a lot of money on various schemes, many of which are not helping sex workers of the organisations that they gave money to, and were not actually money in women's hands. They weren't increasing. They increased the universal credit a tiny bit, but it wasn't good enough, and it still wasn't enough, and it was only for people that could access the universal credit. So it was an important report. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Laura. And now we have a question from Katie for Laura C. So you mentioned how the relatively small sample size of the relatively small sample size of the research, and understandably so. So she's just wondering whether there's a hope or a plan to expand the study at all.
Yeah, so I have not had a chance really to think through next steps yet, but yeah, I think there is definitely scope to explore this in more detail. So when the survey was online and folks could respond to it, it was 18 months ago now. So I think there's scope to think about how Caitlin's mentioning about the upcoming deadline for applying for settled status. So I think we need to be really mindful of documenting experiences that result from things like that. So I think there's definitely scope to look at this in more detail. I'd be really keen. We used an online survey this time. It was an unfunded piece of research largely, which meant that we used an online survey to kind of get views and experiences quite quickly, but I'd be really keen to explore it in more depth by interviewing migrant sex workers about their experience, getting a much more in-depth perspective that way. But I think we've also got to be mindful of the kind of research burden that we place on groups like ECP. So it's I think a balancing act between making sure that we're doing research that is needed and has some value in terms of adding to the sex workers' rights movement, whilst not taking too much time and resource from organisations like ECP. So there's a balancing act there. But yeah, definitely, I think there's scope for us to think about a continuation project to carry on monitoring these experiences and keep finding ways really to take action to push back against some of the negative experiences that we're seeing all too clearly that migrant sex workers are facing.
Thank you, Laura. So now we have a few comments coming in about legalization. Oh, sorry, Chrissy, would you like to?
Yeah, I'd just like to clarify something, because I might have given the wrong impression about who's doing the action alert. But it is a collective work that's being done by Global Women Against Deportation, against deportations. And the other thing I haven't made clear is that I'm also women of colour in the Global Women's Strike. And we have been very active over, I was going to say millennia, but certainly since the 70s in the anti-deportation movement. So I think it's, just wanted to make sure that people understood that it is a collective action of many groups here at the centre.
Thank you, Chrissy. So as adding on to just what I was observing just now in the comments, we are having certain discussions about the notion of legalization of sex work. So would anybody like to address, whether the ECP or any of the organizations are for or against legalization?
Yeah, I can. Sorry, is the question just whether we support legalization or not?
Yes, and also there's been a few comments about the fact that legalization may be a better system. So just any comments about that?
Okay. No, we are for, and since we began, have been for the decriminalisation of sex work, with the removal of the criminal laws out of so that it's no longer in the criminal law. Legalization, decriminalisation, we want, as has been implemented in New Zealand and in some states in Australia, where it's been removed from the criminal law, and it's seen as a health and it's different legislation, and the legislation in New Zealand is the criminal legislation was replaced by health and safety legislation. Legalization, as they have in Germany, for example, is still state-run prostitution. It's not prostitution is not taken out of the criminal law. It's only legal in certain settings that the state chooses, and it's different in different areas. And mostly women are unable to work legally, and often you have to register as a sex worker where it's legal, and most women are not able to do that. And so most women end up still under legalized systems working illegally. And so it sets up this two-tier system where most women are working illegally still anyway, and you still can face criminal sanctions in legalized places. So we don't want legalization, we want decriminalization. So things like loitering and soliciting, brothel keeping removed from the criminal law, and so you can no longer be arrested for those offences. And I wanted to just add on the question of what you can do. We have a petition for decriminalisation on our website, which you can sign, and it's you can watch our video, our Make a Women Safe video, which is on there, and then sign for decriminalisation. And yeah, keep in touch, and also write to your MP with our tool on the website, where you just put in your postcode, and the MP comes up on there for you, so you don't have to look for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So the next question would be regarding Windrush. At least 21 people died before getting compensation. 500 people were waiting over a year. Home Office recently gave Voice for Change £500,000 to disperse to groups to raise awareness and support engagement re the Windrush scheme. It is shocking the Home Office is giving hush funds, corruption money, funds that should have gone immediately to victims of hostile environment. Can anybody comment on this?
I mean, I can just comment in complete agreement. Like the compensation scheme was completely mismanaged. It never should have been out. It never should have been in the power of the Home Office to begin with. As you say, so many families are still waiting for their compensation. The waiting time is on average over a year, I think. So it's not good enough at all. I would recommend people have a look at Wendy Williams' report and the recommendations that she sets out for what needs to change within the Home Office in order to see justice for Windrush generation and to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. JCWI very much supports all of her recommendations there. But yeah, just to echo what you said.
Yeah, Chrissy?
Yeah, I think there's something else going on which we need to discuss, which is that the government is using and has used consistently NGOs and charities. It's put a layer in between those of us, who are fighting for justice, and people who have a different agenda, often one of personal ambition, to run or to climb up to the glass ceiling, and they'll, who knows whose bidding they're doing, but it certainly isn't the demands that women make on the front line. A good example, including this one that has just been raised, has been the example of how St Mungo's were the ones who worked directly with the Home Office to expose who was rough sleeping. That got called out, and it's down to those of us, who are on who see what is happening, to actually spell it out. I mean, we cannot have NGOs calling for time limits on detention of 28 days. If the women that we're working say, we don't want 1 hour inside a detention centre, we cannot allow that. And it is incumbent on us to call that out when we see it. And that is the only, that's one of the ways to stop it, is to expose what the Home Office does in relation to undermining our movement.
Thank you, Chrissy. So another question just come in. I asked, what are your views on the Nordic model, and would it work in the UK? So for those unfamiliar, the Nordic model is the work legislation usually seen in the Nordic countries, where the buying of sex is criminalized, so the client is criminalized in the Nordic model. So would anybody like to respond to that question? Laura?
Yeah, I can. So we absolutely do not want the Nordic model. We oppose it wholly. It doesn't reduce prostitution as it claims to. It doesn't even decriminalize sex workers as it claims to. But it does make it more dangerous for sex workers. So, for example, the clients are already criminalised in Northern Ireland, and curb crawling is already criminalised in England and Wales. And so we already know the impact of criminalising clients in that way. And when it's implemented, all that happens is that women are running from the police in order to avoid attracting the police, so are going into more isolated areas to avoid detention. The client doesn't want to hang around, so you don't have any time to negotiate, you don't have time to check them out, you don't have time for your friend to take down the number plate. All those kind of basic safety mechanisms that you would want to be doing in order to screen a client and work out whether you want to get in the car or not, you can't, because you're worried that the police is coming along. And the thing about the Nordic model is it says that prostitution is all violence and therefore should be stopped. But first of all, it's not all violence, and sex workers know the difference between consenting and non-consenting sex, and do want the violence that sex workers report. Sex workers want dealing with, but often can't get anything done about it, and don't want the police going after clients that you're not complaining about. And secondly, there's nothing in the model which says, if you want to reduce prostitution, then you have to deal with the reasons why women are in prostitution in the first place. If you're serious about reducing it, you have to deal with women's poverty. I mean, benefit sanctions on their own have caused massive increases in prostitution. And so if you want to reduce that straight away, you would stop benefit sanctions. That's just one small thing that would bring down the numbers of sex workers immediately. And so if that's what you want to do, then we agree with that, and we want to reduce women's poverty and reduce prostitution, but we don't want to do it via criminalisation. We want to do it via money in women's hands and and alternatives to prostitution. So that's our view on it.
Yep, Laura C.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in because I didn't mention earlier when I was talking about some of the findings from the research, but we did actually ask sex workers who responded to the survey for their views and experiences around sex work laws, and overwhelmingly migrant sex workers in the report are in favour of decriminalisation. So I just wanted to share what one sex worker said. And they said decriminalisation is a model that assures safety, allows us to work together, be visible, and go to the authorities without fear. And that is particularly important for marginalised groups. And just to say, not one of the respondents in the survey suggested that the Swedish model, that the so-called Nordic model, would bring any benefit to them. Quite the contrary, as Laura spelled out really clearly, it causes all sorts of harm. And that harm is well documented in all the countries around the world that have adopted that criminalising the client approach. So it's something that we see cropping up in the UK. We often see particularly Labour MPs advocating for criminalising the client, and it's something that we if we are allies to the sex workers' rights movement, then we need to strongly oppose for all of the reasons Laura's outlined.
Thank you very much, and keeping an eye on the time. I would end with that. Also, no more questions in the comments. I would just like to say a thank you to everyone for your questions, and thank you to our amazing speakers. I think what it really highlighted today is the importance of listening to the voices and the lived experiences of people that really bear the brunt of these hostile policies. There are many useful links in the chat, so please do take a look at them. A big thank you to the Crossroads Women's Centre and all the groups that work alongside us in our fight towards decriminalisation and justice for all. And please follow us on social media. Our website is prostitutescollective.net. We are on Twitter at prostitutescall and on Facebook as the English Prostitutes. So thank you so much for joining us on this webinar tonight, and have a good evening, everybody. Goodbye.